And Ronnie had
Where's
called.
that?
It's on the far east end of the county, East County. And Ronnie called and asked if I would speak today on trivia. I'm very involved with the East County Historical Society. My grandchildren are 7 generations East County, and I don't think I realized how unusual that was till I was probably in my 50s. And at that point, I started doing some genealogy. Couldn't do genealogy without learning a lot about the history of the area. From that, I eventually wrote a book on the history of East County. And if you'd have asked me 20 years ago if I'd write a book, that probably would have been one of the last things I thought I'd ever do. But today I'm going to talk just a little bit of trivia, and I want to say it's stuff I bet you didn't know. The one thing I find when I'm doing research is little tidbits of things that aren't great, but damn, they're interesting. And it's like, I'll bet you didn't know, and I wonder if you've ever thought about where dog license number one came from. Dog license in Contra Costa County, number one was a German Shepherd named King from Brentwood. And we have the dog license hanging in the museum out on Sellers Avenue. Some of you may not have known that there were originally 5 tribes of Indians that lived on Mount Diablo. And for many years, we knew that they had been there for 500 or 600 years. We could date them back that far. When the Los Vaqueros Reservoir went in, they exhumed 180 bodies. Those bodies were all shipped to Solano College and studied, and they found that instead of 600 years, they could date them back about 2,500 years. At the end of that study, and before they put the water in the Los Vaqueros, all of those bodies were reburied at the bottom of the lake with a cement cap put on them, and the reservoir was filled. Where the John Marsh house is, we've known for years that that was built on a Indian burial ground because it was the high spot of the property. And if you dig down 18 inches is under the foundation of the John Marsh house, you would find remains of all 5 of those tribes that we were talking about. Well, recently, in the last couple of years, if you go down an additional 18 inches, they have found more remains that are not from the same tribes. These are called the Windmill tribe, and those date back like 10,000 to 12,000 years. They're the oldest Indian remains that have been located in California. The only other place is up in Ione. About 10 years ago, they were doing some oil drilling, and an archaeologist on the job found some remains that dated back that far, and he couldn't identify a tribe, and so he didn't have a tribe's name to put with it. When he was asked where he found the remains, he pulled out a map and he drew a circle next to the windmill, and that's how the tribe had gotten named. And you'll probably be hearing a lot more about it because the John Marsh House is now part of the California State Park. It's the largest historic state park in California. It's over 3,800 acres, and the whole Indian background that goes with that property is something we're going to be hearing a lot more about. The early history is really interesting with the Indians, but as we start moving towards today, by 1827, Jeremiah Smith, who is considered the first European to cross the Sierras, came into this area. Thank you. Great. Joseph Walker was coming about the same time. Jeremiah Smith was a trapper, wilderness wanderer, and trapped beaver and otter here in the whole Delta area. By 1837, John Marsh came to the area. John Marsh originally came up the Santa Fe Trail, and he came into Los Angeles. He stayed there for a year. When he rode into Los Angeles on horseback, he had his saddlebags, had 5 books and a few important papers in it. They asked him what he did for a living. He pulled out his Harvard diploma, which was written in Latin, and he told the crowd that he was a doctor, hoping none of them could read Latin. They couldn't, and he was actually a teacher. But fortunate for his future patients, he also had had a lot of medical training, just had not gotten the doctor he was working under to sign him off. He worked as a doctor in Los Angeles for a year, saved up $500, came to San Jose, and in San Jose met Jose Noriega. Jose Noriega had some land in what he called the Badlands. He owned all the land from the base of Mount Diablo to the river, 17,831 acres. That he sold to John Marsh for 3 cents an acre. So what is now Antioch, Brentwood, Byron, Knightson, and all of that at one time was part of John Marsh's rancho.
They bought it for $30,000.
For $30,000. No, he bought it for $500. $500. Marsh, people either loved him or hated him. The historians, and I feel like he kind of got a bad rap. In 1841, Marsh had written back east, raving about the good soil and the good climate, and encouraging people to come west. As the first immigrant train to come west came in 1841 and came to the Marsh's house. So the first immigrants to come to California came to about a mile out of Bridgewood. When they arrived, Marsh was glad to see him and offered him food, offered him a place to stay. He told them they were welcome to go out and get a cow from his herd. And John Bidwell, who it was called the Bidwell-Bartonson train, Bidwell went out and shot his prize ox. John Marsh got ticked. And so he banned him off the ranch, and there ended up being hard feelings. John Marsh was murdered in 1856, and Bidwell lived for another 30 years. The early histories that are written about California, they would always ask him about his arrival, and he would always say, the meanest man I ever met was John Marsh. And so that stigma kind of stuck with him. I'll bet you didn't know that in the 1880s, let that one go. And in the 1880s, Mount Diablo had the largest grizzly bear population in the western United States. And that Grizzly Adams lived on Mount Diablo for a couple of years. If you're familiar with Byron Highway dead ends into Crawl Hollow. If you were to turn right on Crawl Hollow and go up into the Altamont, that's the area where Grizzly Adams actually spent most of his life. But then he ended up on Mount Diablo for at least 2 years. He ended up dying back east. He got involved with a Western traveling show. You may not know that all the towns in East County are railroad towns. Byron, Brentwood, there were 2 little towns between Byron and Tracy. Bethany and Herdland and Tracy were all built on the San Pablo Tulare line in 1878. That line later became the Southern Pacific line. 20 years later, on the Santa Fe line, we get Oakley and Knightson on a line going towards Stockton. And what happened is when they would come in and survey for a railroad, or they'd put a guy on horseback, and he'd ride along, and every 2 hours he'd get off the horse, put a stake in the ground, and where that stake was, they would build a railroad station. Where the railroad stations were built, there became communities. So at one time, there was a little town between Byron and Brentwood called Point of Timber. And when the railroad bypassed Point of Timber, the communities of Byron and Brentwood, they kind of expanded. I found the newspaper there, is such a great resource for historians. And Contra Costa County had the Contra Costa Gazette, which started in the 1850s. So I spend a lot of time in kind of, digging through some of those old newspapers and find lots of great stuff. But not long ago, I found an article in a 1913 in Contra Costa Times that I thought you'd find interesting. There was an appraisal ordered by the Board of Supervisors. In 1913, you could buy Brentwood, all of it, for $511,000. You could buy Byron for a mere $335,000. You could buy Oakley for $168,000. Or you could buy the whole damn county for $48 million. If you're familiar with Vasco Road, there's a stoplight just before you get on to Vasco. And if you look over to the right, at night you can see lights and stuff. That's a sand plant, the silica sand plant. It's been there since John Marsh's days, and it's a 21-mile vein of silica sand that runs all the way to Concord. It ranges from 75 to 400 feet deep. And if you ever drank Gallo wine, you got a little of Byron in your hand, because all of Gallo's bottles are made out of that sand. And it was owned by Uniman Company until a couple of years ago, and it has now been purchased by the Gallo Company, and so they own that silica sand plant.
That little winemaker me.
That's right. In the 1890s, for as far as you could see all through East County, there were acres and acres and acres of wheat. It was the largest wheat producing area between New Orleans and San Francisco. And the thing that was so appealing about the wheat that was grown here is it's so hot that the wheat doesn't have very much moisture in it. So when it is shipped to Europe, which is where most of it was sent, and it wouldn't mildew. Thought you'd find it interesting that in 1934, Bethel Island had federal agents come in and bust the largest bootlegging ring in the state.
Not again.
Wait a minute.
You're still picking on Bethel Island. What can I say?
We got bootleggers out there, must be.
Hadn't changed any since then.
The Delta has
Ours
1,100
is over
miles
that
of
far.
levees. You may not have known that there is 78 miles of deep channels from Stockton to San Francisco. And
Hey, I
yeah,
gotta say something
sure.
that nobody knows here. This Stockton Channel is used 5 times, 10 times more than the Sacramento Channel. There's no boats that go up the Sacramento Channel. They all use the San Joaquin Channel. If you watch every day, you'll see 4, 5, 10 big boats running up the San Joaquin Channel. There's nothing going up the Sacramento Channel anymore.
Very interesting. Thanks. If any of you have heard of Kellogg Creek, Kellogg Creek runs out towards Discovery Bay from the Los Vaqueros Reservoir. Kellogg Creek is named after Mr. Kellogg, who was a cattle rustler and was hung on a tree on the edge of the creek. In 1939, it was decided that they should require fishing licenses. And at that time, they were $2 for a fishing license. And in 1939, there were 8,420 licenses sold in Contra Costa County.
Sounds like the first politicians to me.
I thought you'd also like to know about some folks that have lived here. Joaquin Murrieta, the famous bandit from the gold country, supposedly used the Vasco Caves and Brushy Peak as a hideout. Are you familiar with...
Where's his head hanging?
I don't know. Are you familiar with Sellers Avenue? Sarah Sellers and Samuel Sellers, Sellers Avenue is named after. Sarah Sellers was the first woman in the state of California to serve on the school board. She also started a silk plant near Leighton and planted 3,000 mulberry trees. And in an 1878 article in the Contra Costa Gazette, I love the fact that she's quoted as saying, the reason that people locally love this concept is because I'm putting 9-year-olds to work. So you could get a job for your child. Between Brentwood and Byron, that first sweeping turn, as you're going south on Highway 4, or you follow the railroad tracks, and there's a big sweeping turn there. That turn for years was called Frederick's Corner. Frederick's Corner is named after Major General Robert Fredericks. He was the most decorated officer in modern military history. He earned 9 Purple Hearts. He was good friends with Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower came to his ranch that is right on that corner and met with him many times. And if you are an old movie buff, the movie The Devil's Brigade is about him. And he was the one that started Special Forces. Also, the old Vasco Road, the road that you have there now I call the new Vasco. The old Vasco had a ranch off on the right-hand side, and there were big red barns and stuff around. Well, that was the old Starr Ranch, and it belonged to a gentleman named Oscar Starr. Oscar Starr, as a young man, was an inventor, and he invented some things for a helicopter. And the first helicopter, and his mother was sure he was going to kill himself. So she insisted that he sell it. He sold it to Stanley Heller, who went on to complete the project and came out with the helicopter. So he started working on tractors. He got a job with the best tractor company in San Leandro, working on tractors. And then the Holt brothers in Stockton heard what great things he was doing for Best. So they went and offered him a few more dollars, and he went to work for Holt brothers. And then Best came back, hired him, offered him a few more dollars. He ended up going back to San Leandro. They went back and forth 5 times before the owner of both companies got together, and they started a company called Caterpillar Tractor. And Oscar Starr is credited with, I wrote it down because I can never remember. He developed a gasoline engine for track laying tractors. And he is given credit for creating 2 for Caterpillar Tractor. And when he was first hired and when Caterpillar Tractor first started, he was being paid more than the president of each of the other companies. You may find it interesting that Merle Haggard lived nights in one time. He was 3 years old, and his parents were here picking fruit. Helen Wells was here in the 1920s. She was from Byron. She was Sylvester Wells' daughter, had learned how to play tennis at the Byron Hot Springs, and ended up a world champion tennis player. She was on the cover of Life magazine in the late 1920s. Richard Veal is from Knightson. R.R. Veal, well, and Veal Track is named after him. Richard Veal was sheriff of Contra Costa County for 42 years, the longest serving sheriff in the United States, and the oldest. He was still an active sheriff into his 70s, and there's a bronze statue of him, or a bust of him, in the court hall, in the courthouse in Martinez. This will give you something to tell someone at your next dinner party that I'm sure will impress someone. Patty Schaefer, whose husband had the blacksmith shop in Brentwood, and he was the constable. No, he wasn't constable. I'm trying to think of what they called it. He was in law enforcement, justice of the peace. That's what he was. At a senior moment. Anyway, he was justice of the peace, and his wife ran he also had a mortuary, and his wife ran the mortuary. Patty Schaefer is the first woman in the state of California to get an embalming license. Now, have you always wondered? You may be familiar with the Donner Party. The Donner Party in 1846, there were 88 in the original party, and 46 perished on Donner Summit. Well, George Donner and his wife both died on the mountain, but their daughters were saved, and Frances Donner ended up settling in Byron and raised her family there, and is buried in Union Cemetery, south of Brentwood. You may have heard of Hoagie Carmichael. Hoagie Carmichael wrote Stardust, Georgia on Your Mind, Lazy Bones, and he lived in the Brentwood Hotel in 1936 and 1937. Jack London spent a lot of time in East County. His first job was out on Bolin Island. He worked for in a cannery there. He was only 13 when he got his first job. In later years, after he got famous from his writing, he spent a lot of time at the Byron Hot Springs. He was an alcoholic, and he would go there periodically to dry out, and did a lot of writing in that area. Became close personal friends with Bob Kelso and Captain Lint, who was from the Point of Timber area. Fatty Arbuckle spent a lot of time at the hot springs. A lot of who's who from the late teens and early 20s spent time there. You may have heard of Butch Colombo. Butch Colombo was a football player for St. Louis Browns in 1937. And he owned what we know as Sonia's today. At that time, it was the Sportsman Club in Knightson. Johnny Snyder. In 1931, he was named the world champion all-around cowboy at the rodeo in Los Angeles. And he was born and raised in Knightson. And on Monday nights, I am very involved with the East County Historical Society. And on Monday nights, we have the resource room open, and I do research. And hardly a Monday night goes by that I don't find something that is just darn interesting. And the other night, I was looking through some things I was looking for information about the Hoffman family off of Marsh Creek Road is Hoffman Lane. And so that was the family I was looking up. And I found some stuff about these two brothers that had come from Prussia, and they were bachelors and they were young men, and they got land and they were told that they had to build a house on their land, and they had a certain period of time to do it. And so they built one house right on the property line. So the front door was in one brother's property and the back door was in the other brother's property. And that satisfied what they had agreed to do. And Ferdinand Hoffman went to Martinez, where he met the love of his life and married her. And she was the maid of honor at John Muir's wedding. Now that's not earth-shaking, and that's not, but damn, that's interesting, and that's why I'm hooked on history. I'd be glad to answer any questions if you have any questions that I could answer about East County.
What was the year on that?
You know, I really don't remember. I'm assuming would have been 1870s probably.
I'm not going to argue.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.